The Battle of Plassey, the victory that created an empire. Happenings before the war. After Clive's unauthorized expedition against the French fort at Chandanagar, Siraj-ud-dwala, the Nawab of Bengal, decided to break the treaty that he had signed with the British. Clive then declared war to the Nawab and left Chandanagar and undertook his famous campaign in Bengal. The Nawab assembled his army at Plassey. Meanwhile, Mir Jafar, the commander-in-chief of the Nawab's army, had made secret proposals to the British authorities at Calcutta and was ready to betray his ruler in the exchange for the title of the Nawab. Both parties came to a secret agreement on June 5, 1757. On 18 June 1757, Clive reached Katwa, about 80 miles north of Calcutta. There was much travel for him. He had 800 Europeans and 2,200 Indians. Siraj-ud-dwala, in his entrenched camp at Plassey, was said to have about 50,000 trained men with heavy artillery. On the morning of 21st June, Clive called a war council, with Major Kilpatrick, the second in command, and 5 seniors, and put to it the question whether in our present situation, without assistance and on our bottom, it would be prudent to attack the Nawab, or whether we should wait till joined by some country power. After discussion, Clive and 12 of his officers voted that the danger of defeat was too great if they should try to advance. They must retreat. On the other hand, 7 officers, led by Major Ayerkut, voted against this and advised an instant attack on the Nawab's camp. By 13-7, the council decided not to fight. Then Clive was left by himself. He was not happy in his mind, and as he strolled about in the shade of the trees, he began to think the whole question over again. Delay, he knew, was dangerous, and would moreover give time for the French to come to the help of the Nawab. The more the delay, the worse the position for the English. In an hour, Clive has made up his mind. He would fight. During the day, no movement was made. The little army started at sunset, and after a terrible march in pouring rain, often through waist deep water, reached Plassey at 1 a.m. in the morning. They camped in a grove of mango trees near the river, which was not more than a mile from Siraj-ud-dwala's army. The grove was about 800 meters long by 300 meters broad, and round it was a ditch and a bank of earth. It was a good position to defend. Close at hand stood a little hunting box belonging to Siraj-ud-dwala, and which was surrounded by a strong wall. Clive at once occupied this house. At night, as Clive reflected in his tent, the monsoon burst with torrents of rain, a warning that action must be speedy or it would be impossible. Clive must have had some bad moments in the flickering candlelight beneath the thudding of the rain. The next afternoon came what he had probably been waiting for, another message from Mir Jafar. He was on the march. He would inform Clive of his arrival at the Nawab's camp. The time for action had come. This was enough. 2 hours after receiving the message, Clive crossed the river and made his way in pouring rain to the Plassey Grove. The next morning, 23rd June 1757, was clear and sunny. In the hard light, Clive surveyed the scene of the battle. About 1.5 km northward of the hunting house, the river makes a huge bend to the southwest in the form of a horseshoe. It contained a peninsula of about 1 km in diameter, which shrinks at its neck to a width of some 450 meters from stream to stream. About 275 meters to the south of this peninsula, an entrenchment had been thrown up. It ran for about 200 meters straight inland and parallel to the grove, and then turned at an obtuse angle northward for about 5 kilometers. The angle itself was defended by a redoubt or fortification. Some 275 meters to the east of this redoubt, but outside the entrenchment, stood a hillock covered with trees. About 800 meters to the south of this hillock lay a small tank, and yet 90 meters farther south a second and much larger tank, both of them surrounded by a mound of earth. The Nawab's mighty army was comprised of 35,000 foot soldiers, 15,000 horsemen, and 54 pieces of artillery. The infantry was mostly armed with matchlocks, pikes, swords, bows and arrows, and a considerable number of rockets. The cavalry was particularly fine. The men were a very superior class of Upper Hindustan, and their horses were of a larger and stronger breed than any the British had met before in India. The guns were for the most part of large caliber, 18 pounders, 24 pounders and 32 pounders, and were carried together with their crews and ammunition on large stages, which were tugged by 40 or 50 yokes of oxen in front and propelled by elephants from behind. At the dawn of June 23rd, the Nawab's forces began to stream by many outlets from the camp towards the grove. Mir Jafar was deployed on the left wing with his division. Some 45 French sent by the French East India Company under Monsieur Saint-Fraise, who had formerly been of the garrison of Chandanagar, took post with 4 light field guns at the larger tank which was nearest to the grove, while 2 heavy guns under a native officer was posted to Saint-Fraise's right between him and the river. In support of these advanced parties were 5,000 horses and 7,000 foot soldiers under Nawab's most faithful general Mir Mudin. The rest of the Nawab's army extended itself in a huge curve from the hillock before the entrenchment to within 800 meters of the southern angle of the grove. The British could not advance against the force in their front without exposing themselves to the overwhelming attack on their right flank. Clive watched these dispositions from the Nawab's hunting house and was surprised at the numbers and confidence of the enemy. The East India Company's army, consisting of 950 Europeans, 2,100 native Indian sepoys, and a small number of guns, was vastly outnumbered. The Nawab had an army of about 50,000 with artillery operated by some 45 French soldiers sent by the French East India Company. However, 16,000 of the 50,000 were under the control of Mir Jafar. Along with Mir Jafar, the troops commanded by Yar Latif and Rai Durlab did not take part in the battle under a secret pact made with the British. Only 5,000 troops actually engaged in battle, which was still significantly superior to the estimated 2,500 British soldiers facing them, and there was a time when Clive thought that he would be forced to retreat. He drew his troops outside the bank which surrounded the grove and formed them in a single line, with their left resting on the hunting house and their front towards the nearest tank. The Europeans occupied the center of the line, formed in 4 divisions totaling about 950 men, partly of the East India Company's troops and partly of the 39th Foot Division, while 100 Indo-Portuguese topazes also were ranked within it. 3 6-pounders were posted on each flank of these European troops, manned by 50 men of the Royal Artillery and by 57 seamen. And to the right and the left of these guns, 2,100 sepoys were drawn up in two equal divisions. The line extended for 550 meters beyond the grove, but the enemy at this point was too remote to advance upon the British flank before dispositions could be made to meet them. Two more field guns and two howitzers were posted 180 meters in advance of the left division of the sepoys under shelter of two brick kilns. Therewith, Clive's order of battle was complete, and the handful of 3,000 men stood up to meet the 50,000 men strong army of the Nawab. At 8 am, the action was opened by the firing of one of the French guns at the tank. The shot fell on target, killing one man and wounding another of the British Grenadier Company posted on the right of the Bengal European Battalion. Then the whole of the enemy's guns, from the tanks in the front along the whole sweep of the curving line, opened heavy and continuous fire. The British guns replied, and with effect. But Clive lost 20 Europeans and 30 sepoys in the first half hour of the cannonade. At about 8:30 am, Clive ordered the whole of his force to fall back into the grove. So his battalion phased about, passed into the trees and vanished from sight. Wild yells of elation rose up from the Nawab's army, whose entire line closed in nearer upon the grove. The Indians then renewed the cannonade with redoubled energy. The shots, however, did little damage, for the British had been ordered to lie down behind the mud banks. Meanwhile, Clive's field guns, firing through embrasures made in the bank, wrought greater damage at closer range than before. Until 11 am, the two armies continued to cannonade each other. At 11 am, Clive called a council of officers and decided that it would be best to maintain the position until nightfall and to take the offensive at midnight and attack the enemy's camp. In the meantime, British troops were sheltered and consequently were suffering no loss, whilst from behind the banks which enveloped the grove, they continued to pour a well-directed fire on the enemy. This resulted in creating some havoc among the masses, and now and then exploding their ammunition, which, packed close to the guns on the raised stages, caused much loss and confusion. Around noon, a heavy storm of rain, which had been holding off for some hours, swept over the plain, drenching both armies to the skin. The British had trampolines ready to cover their ammunition, but the Indians had taken no such precaution, and consequently most of their powder was damaged. Their fire began to slacken, while that of the British was as lively as ever. At about 1 pm, believing that the British must be in the same problem as himself, Mir Madan advanced from the tank towards the grove to drive the British from it. His troops were met by a deadly fire of grape shots. Mir Madan's cavalry was dispersed and he himself was mortally wounded. Finally, they were driven back. When Siraj-ud-dwala heard that Mir Madan had been killed, he became terrified. The cannonade was resumed at once, but more feebly than before, presumably because the powder was still damp. Bewildered and baffled at Mir Madan's death, Siraj-ud-dwala called Mir Jafar and implored him to save his life and honor. Mir Jafar advised the Nawab to suspend action for the day and start afresh the next morning. Furthermore, he wrote to Clive informing him of what had taken place and urging him to push on, for victory was in his hand. His treacherous chief minister, Rai Durlab, persuaded him to give orders to his troops to retire behind their entrenchments and advised him to leave the field while there was yet time. The English, he said, were advancing and the day was lost. He told the Nawab to quit the field and save himself, and assured him that his generals would hold the English in check and prevent their further advance. The unhappy young Nawab, in an evil hour for himself, took this advice, and getting on a swift camel, fled to Murshidabad, taking with him as a guard 2,000 of his best cavalry. The remainder of his army began to retire. At about 2 p.m., the cannon fire of the Indian army ceased. The teams were harnessed to the guns, and the whole army, turning about, flowed back slowly towards the entrenchments. While all this was going on, Clive resolved to make no offensive movement before night. He retired to the hunting house to snatch a few minutes of sleep after the anxiety and fatigue of the previous day, giving orders to Kilpatrick to act on the defensive only. Clive was roused by a message from Major Kilpatrick, which brought him back speedily into the field. Despite the withdrawal of the Nawab's army, St. Fries and his little party still held their position in the tank. Kilpatrick perceived that the position was one from which the enemy's flank could be cannonaded during their retreat. He sent word to Clive that he was about to attack it. Clive, waked abruptly from sleep, sharply reprimanded Kilpatrick for taking such a step without orders. Major Kilpatrick told Clive that he noticed that the enemy were limbering up their guns and preparing to retire. He saw that the French gunners and their guns were being left unsupported in a very dangerous position, a position from which, if the English could take it, the enemy might be fired into on their flank as they retired. On seeing that the major was right, he took command of his 250 Europeans with 2 light guns and himself led the advance against the tank. He sent Kilpatrick back to bring forward the rest of the army. St. Fries, though terribly outnumbered, fought manfully. But finding himself deserted and betrayed by his supports, he gradually gave way, disputing each inch of the ground and deliberately limbering up his guns, retired in perfect order to the redoubt at the angle of the entrenchment, and made ready for action once more. Meanwhile, during the advance of the British, the southernmost division of the Nawab's army was observed to be holding aloof from the rest of the host and approaching nearer to the grove. These were the troops of Mir Jafar, but their movement was construed as a design upon the boats and baggage in the grove. Accordingly, 3 platoons of sepoys and a field gun were dispatched to hold them in check. The division therefore retired slowly but still remained significantly apart from the remainder of the Indian army. The British forces continued pushing forward. Around 3 p.m., the main body of the British had reached the tank and, planting their artillery on the mound, opened fire on the enemy behind their entrenchments. Thereupon, many of the Nawab's troops faced about again and moved out into the plain to meet them. The infantry opened a heavy fire while the artillery likewise wheeled about to enter the fight anew. However, the Nawab's army was now entirely under the command of the conspirators. Clive perceived that his only chance was to press his attack home before the resistance to him could assume any organized form. He thereupon pushed forward half of his infantry and 3 guns. The remaining forces were sent to some rising ground 200 meters to the left of it, and at the same time detaching a 150 men to occupy a tank close to the entrenchments and to keep up a fire of musketry upon them. From these stations, the firing was renewed at closer range than before and with admirable efficiency. The Indians suffered great loss. The teams attached to their heavy artillery were so much cut up that the guns could not be brought into action. Nevertheless, St. Fry's field pieces at the redoubt were still well and regularly served. The Indians, though lacking leadership, were able, under favour of the ground and of their immense superiority in numbers, to carry on the fight with some spirit. The entrenchments themselves, the hillock to the eastward of the redoubt, and every hollow or point of vantage were crammed with matchlock men. While the cavalry hovered around, threatening continually to charge, though always kept at a distance by the British artillery. At length, Clive realized that the isolated division of the Nawab's army by the grove must be that of Mir Jafar, and that his flank and rear were safe. Clive resolved therefore to cut matters short. He recalled the sepoys previously detached to guard the boats and sent forward 2 columns. The right column led by Kilpatrick at the head of the Madras European Regiment, and the left by Coote at the head of the Grenadiers of the 39th Foot Division, to make simultaneous attack upon the redoubt on one side and the hillock on the other, while the main body moved up between them in support. The right column gained an eminence, commanding a portion of the Indian entrenchments, while the left column, charging the redoubt, succeeded in gaining a footing inside. When the right party with cheers rushed down the sloping ground, the 2 divisions united and started attacking the French. St. Frais, perceiving that he was now wholly unsupported, abandoned his guns and retired. The Indian troops within the camp then all fled, abandoning their artillery. At 5 p.m., the British were in possession of the Nawab's entrenchments and camp, and the Battle of Plassey was won. The victorious British columns halted on the field of battle only sufficiently long to enable them to procure fresh bullocks to drag their guns. The British then pursued the Nawab's army 10 km up to Doapur and captured more than 40 guns that they had abandoned. At the end of the engagement, Mir Jafar sent a congratulatory message to Clive. The troops of Mir Jafar encamped in the neighbourhood of the British force that night. Outcome: the defection of some of Nawab's generals allowed Clive to win this battle against all odds. Indeed, about 3/4 of the Nawab's army, the corps under Mir Jafar, Yar Latif Khan and Rai Durlab, did not take part to the battle. The British lost 7 Europeans and 16 sepoys were killed. 13 Europeans and 36 sepoys were wounded. The Nawab lost about 500 men. The victory gave the British the dominion over the provinces of Bengal, Orissa and Bihar. Some historians are of the opinion that the Battle of Plassey virtually led to the foundation of British rule in India. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel because this motivates me a lot. Thank you.